picture this. You are in a crowded, neon-lit club in the early 1980s.
Oh, I could see it.
Right. The bass is thumping, and the synthesizers are just driving this incredibly infectious, upbeat rhythm.
It's like the ultimate Friday night escape.
Exactly. Everyone around you is just completely losing themselves in the music, dancing with absolute joy. But if you actually stop moving for a second.
Just stand perfectly still on the dance floor.
Yeah, stand still and just listen to the words the vocalist is singing. You suddenly realize you are dancing to this vivid, agonizing confession about severe childhood trauma.
And depression. Deep psychological isolation.
It's this massive, almost uncomfortable paradox.
Oh.
And today we are taking a deep dive into the architects behind that exact paradox.
Which is such a fascinating topic.
It really is. We've got an incredible stack of research today, anchored by this great music history column from Monumental Movement Records, or MMR, and it analyzes the legendary 80s band Tears for Fears.
It really is the ultimate bait and switch in pop music history, you know? Because when we think of 1980s new wave, we naturally think of
bright colors, big hair.
Outward style, MTV gloss, and just this kind of futuristic, shiny escapism. But Tears for Fears completely inverted that formula.
They really did.
They weren't just making catchy hit songs. They were actively testing the absolute limits of how much raw, unfiltered human emotion could be injected directly into a mainstream pop format.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how these two musicians completely rewired pop music, using it not as simple entertainment, but as an active, breathing psychological tool.
And to really understand the mechanics of how they built this, we have to start with where they came from.
Right.
The MMR source notes, they formed in 1981 in the city of Bath, England.
Now, if you've never been, Bath is famous for its quiet, historic atmosphere. It's full of ancient Roman baths and beautiful, rigid Georgian architecture.
Yeah, it has this very serene, almost polite upper crust air to it.
But I was reading through the notes on the two founders of the band, Roland Orzabal and Curt Smith, and it sounds like their actual reality behind closed doors was, well, the polar opposite of that polite society.
Oh, absolutely. That contrast is basically the entire engine of their early music. You have the external environment of Bath, which is historically rigid and quiet, and then you have the sheer domestic turbulence going on inside their homes.
Right, because Orzabal was born into a family of Spanish descent, and his childhood was deeply marked by tension.
Yeah, his father suffered from severe anxiety and physical ailments, which created a profoundly stressful and lonely environment.
And Smith was in a similar boat, right?
He was. Smith grew up in a highly unstable working-class family environment across town. So for these two kids, picking up instruments was not a casual hobby.
It wasn't just to look cool for girls or pass the time.
Not at all. It was a literal refuge. It was the only place they had any actual control.
Right, it was a survival mechanism. But I saw a note in the research about a band called Graduate that they started before Tears for Fears, and apparently it completely imploded.
Yeah, it didn't go well.
If music was their sanctuary, what went so wrong with that first attempt?
Well, what went wrong was that Graduate relied entirely on what Orzabal later called outward style. They were just playing the game of the era.
Like wearing the skinny ties and playing upbeat ska pop?
Exactly. They essentially tried to fit into a mold that looked good on stage. But it had absolutely nothing to do with how they actually felt.
Wow.
They quickly realized the limitations of playing dress-up with their music. There was just this profound, aching disconnect between the shiny music they were expected to play and the dark reality they were living with every day.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this realization is the turning point, right?
Absolutely.
It's like they realized they were building a house with a beautiful facade, but absolutely no foundation. They tore it down to build entirely from their own psychological blueprints.
Which was a massive risk.
Right. And according to the column, they found their new blueprint in a very specific and frankly intense place, Arthur Gonoff's Primal therapy.
Which is actually where the name Tears for Fears comes from.
Yeah. But I have to admit, I'm a little confused here. How do you take a clinical psychiatric practice?
The screaming, yeah.
Yeah, the idea of recovering your mental health by literally screaming out repressed childhood emotions in a doctor's office and translate that into a synth pop song. How does that mechanism actually work?
It's a great question because it sounds impossible on paper.
It really does.
To understand how they did it, you have to understand what primal therapy actually is. Janov's theory argued that neurosis is caused by the repressed pain of childhood trauma.
Okay.
In therapy, the patient is encouraged to descend back into that infantile state, feel that agonizing, buried pain completely and physically release it.
Like literally sobbing or screaming.
Exactly. It is visceral, it is loud, and it is entirely about confronting the ugliest parts of your psyche. And Orzabal and Smith didn't just borrow the edgy aesthetic of therapy for a band name.
They actually used it.
They adopted its actual mechanics.
Wait, so they literally turned the recording studio into a therapist's couch?
Precisely. They mapped that clinical process directly onto musical composition. The act of writing the verses became the act of unearthing a repressed, painful memory.
Oh, wow. So building the tension in the pre-chorus.
Mirrored the psychological buildup of anxiety, yes.
That is wild. And then the massive sweeping chorus became the primal release, the scream.
Exactly. The decision to turn inner pain directly, almost uncomfortably, into the actual structural DNA of the music is what separated them from literally every other new wave band of that era.
Because they weren't writing love songs.
No, or Dancing in the Club anthems. They were writing case studies of their own minds.
Which, if you're listening to this and wondering how the music business works, wasn't exactly what record executives in the early 80s were eager to greenlight.
Oh, they hated it.
The research points out that once they had this intense psychological blueprint, they took their demo tapes to the major labels, and the labels basically said, this is way too dark.
Yeah, nobody wants to listen to this.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating here is that the labels were accurately diagnosing the sound, but they were completely misjudging its value.
Right, because the music industry saw darkness as an impenetrable commercial barrier. They thought pop music had to be purely escapist.
But for Tears for Fears, that exact darkness was their unique edge. In a marketplace completely saturated with superficiality and robotic synth pop, their willingness to be openly wounded became their strongest asset.
They were offering something real to a generation of kids who also felt alienated.
Exactly.
And that defiance ultimately led to their 1983 debut album, The Hurting. This wasn't just a random collection of singles either.
And it was very intentional.
The MMR column points out this was a conceptually unified album. It acted almost like a roadmap of a psychological process, dealing entirely with childhood trauma.
You have tracks like Mad World and Pale Shelter.
Right. These were songs written about deeply personal, incredibly specific feelings of isolation, but they hit these universal emotional chords.
They really did.
But wait, I have to push back on the vibe here. If the music is essentially a heavy, localized therapy session about severe childhood pain and repressed agony,
Yeah.
why were audiences enthusiastically dancing to it? How does that disconnect happen on a practical level?
It's one of the most bizarre and compelling phenomenons of their early career. You kind of have to picture what their live shows from the Hurting era actually looked like.
Okay.
The music has this driving, infectious synth pop tempo. They're using drum machines and catchy keyboard riffs, so the audiences are naturally moving to it.
Enjoying it like any other club hit of 1983.
Right. But up on stage, the band is performing almost totally expressionless,
Wait, really? Just standing there?
practically motionless. Wearing serious expressions, delivering these devastating lyrics with absolute deadpan sincerity.
That is the ultimate buzzkill if you're actually paying attention to the words.
Exactly. The visual imbalance was striking, and it created a massive amount of internal friction. Orzabal, in particular, had highly complex feelings about this dynamic.
I can imagine.
Imagine pouring out the most traumatic, vulnerable aspects of your childhood, the things that keep you up at night. And the crowd is essentially treating it like background music for a Friday night party.
They were completely missing the deep lyrical meaning.
They were. Critics picked up on this heavyweight too, calling the album overly introspective.
But even the harshest critics had to admit that despite the heavy subject matter, Tears for Fears had successfully birthed a completely new possibility for pop music.
They proved that profound emotional depth and commercial pop formats were not mutually exclusive.
But because Orzabal felt misunderstood by these audiences who were just blindly dancing to his pain, he realized he had to force them to hear him.
Yeah, the quiet, introspective synth pop wasn't cutting it anymore.
He needed a sound so massive it simply couldn't be ignored as just background music, and that desperation directly birthed the stadium-sized sound of their next era.
The monumental 1985 album, Songs from the Big Chair.
Right. But how exactly did they do that? How do you take a deeply internal feeling and make it sound like it belongs in an arena?
The transition from the Hurting to Songs from the Big Chair is really a masterclass in using studio technology to expand an emotional footprint. Better technology allowed for a much more dynamic, open sound. They moved away from the thin, rigid drum machines of the early 80s and started using sweeping organic synthesizer layers.
And massive echoing drum sounds. I read they use techniques like gated reverb to make every snare hit sound like a cannon going off.
Exactly. They took the core theme of primal therapy releasing repressed emotions, and they scaled the acoustics to match.
And the track Shout is the perfect example of this mechanism, isn't it?
It is quite literally a primal scream. It's an anthem of emotional liberation.
It's engineered with these colossal booming beats to be sung by tens of thousands of people at once.
It's not just a private therapy session anymore. It's group therapy for a stadium of 50,000 people.
And that engineering worked almost too well. It triggered a sudden, massive explosion of success, particularly in the American market.
And which they honestly did not see coming.
They were suddenly touring these colossal venues surrounded by a level of fame and media scrutiny that most musicians only dream of.
Yeah, it was intense.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because their whole foundational mission was based on therapy, healing, and confronting anxiety.
Right.
They wanted their pain to be understood by the masses. But did playing massive venues and getting globally famous actually help them process their childhood trauma? Or did it just amplify the stress?
The evidence strongly points to the exact opposite. The MMR source includes a very revealing quote from Curt Smith about this exact period.
Oh, what did he say?
He said the speed of their success was, quote, faster than the heart could keep up with.
Wow.
Imagine trying to do delicate, introspective psychological work while strapped to a rocket ship. The immense pressure of that global spotlight, the grueling tour schedules, it created a pressure cooker.
And it caused Orzabal to develop fear, almost paralyzing perfectionism.
He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. In the studio, he became obsessive, re-recording single, tiny vocal phrases or guitar licks over and over again.
And this obsession began to create the first subtle cracks in his relationship with Smith.
The balance between their human connection and their creative output started to dangerously tilt.
And that perfectionism didn't just fade away after the Big Chair tour ended, it actually dug in deeper.
Oh, it became a monster. It spiraled entirely out of control on their next project.
Right. We are entering the era of the 1989 album, The Seeds of Love. And the research shows this album took over 4 years to make.
4 years in the music industry is an absolute eternity. Trends change entirely in that time.
What exactly is happening for 4 whole years in a recording studio?
What happened was endless, agonizing trial and error. The production of The Seeds of Love represents the absolute extreme of Orzabal's perfectionism.
They completely ditched the sleek, synthesized sound that made them famous, right?
Yeah, they brought in live musicians, full orchestras, gospel choirs. They were chasing this lush, George Martin-style Beatles influence.
That's a dramatic musical shift. They were building incredibly complex, multi-layered song structures.
Structures that required meticulous orchestration. But as they spent millions of dollars agonizing over every single note,
Predictably creating massive strain with their record company.
exactly, and during all of this, the band's internal structure was collapsing.
Because the emotional toll of that kind of micromanagement must have been suffocating.
It was. During those endless, exhausting studio sessions, Curt Smith slowly lost his voice in the creative process.
As Orzabal's control intensified in his quest for a perfect record, Smith just mentally distanced himself to protect his own sanity.
It wasn't a sudden, explosive argument that ended things. It was a long, slow, agonizing fade-out.
Which culminated in his formal departure from the band in 1991.
The tragedy here is profound. Their artistic ambition, which was originally born from a desire to heal their childhood trauma together, had ultimately destroyed the very friendship that built the band in the first place.
So what does this all mean for the legacy of the band at that moment? Because after Smith leaves, Orzabal doesn't just start a new solo project under his own name.
No, he doesn't.
He releases the next album, the 1993 record Elemental, under the Tears for Fears name. He essentially carries on alone.
He does.
And at the time, there was a lot of debate about this. Some fans called it a solo project. Was Orzabal just clinging to brand recognition because it was commercially safer than starting over?
It's a fair question, and it's one Orzabal had to defend vigorously. From his perspective, keeping the name had nothing to do with marketing or brand recognition.
Why did he keep it then?
He chose to keep the name Tears for Fears to protect the heavy personal history and the deep psychological meaning behind it.
Even though the core dynamism of the duo had radically changed.
Right. He believed the ethos of the music, the fearless exploration of inner life and trauma, was still intact. He felt he was still honoring the original mission of primal therapy, even if he was now carrying the flag alone.
He carried it alone for a while, but it seems like the true ethos of Tears for Fears, that deep, trauma-bonded connection they formed back in the quiet streets of Bath, ultimately required both halves of the duo to truly heal.
You can't resolve a broken relationship by yourself.
No. And the story doesn't end with them estranged. In the early 2000s, they finally reconnected.
And I love this detail in the MMR column about their reunion.
Yeah, when they finally got back in the same room, they didn't immediately pick up instruments, did they?
No, and that is so telling about who they are. When they finally let up, they didn't start jamming or planning a lucrative reunion tour. They spent long, extensive periods just talking.
Sitting down at dinners and methodically unpacking their past misunderstandings.
They talked about the resentments that had built up during those obsessive 4 years in the studio for the seeds of love. They addressed their underlying feelings of abandonment and control.
They essentially had to go through their own interpersonal therapy before they could make music again.
Time and distance had done what immediate success couldn't. It had turned raw conflict into genuine, mature understanding.
Which paved the way for a totally new era of their music, culminating much later in their 2022 album, The Tipping Point.
And this is where the mechanics of their songwriting completely shift again.
This wasn't the sound of two angry, defensive young men anymore. The themes moved away from the fierce introspection of youth and became what the article calls a summation of life.
And that maturity was incredibly hard-earned. During the long production of this album, Orzabal experienced the profound tragedy of losing his wife.
And that deep, mature grief heavily impacted the emotional landscape of the record. It's like they evolved from screaming about the wounds of childhood, demanding the world pay attention, to quietly and reflectively tracing the scars of adulthood.
The pain is still there, but their relationship to it is completely transformed.
It's no longer a primal scream, it's a shared acknowledgement of survival.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that evolution is exactly why their legacy is so enduring. Their music continues to gain new meaning as time passes, because it was built on a foundation of genuine psychological reality, not just outward style.
Think about a song like Mad World. It didn't just stay trapped in 1983.
No, it has been constantly covered, stripped down to just a piano and vocals, and reinterpreted by entirely new generations.
You hear it in modern TV shows, in film soundtracks.
Often with a completely different, much more melancholic emotional resonance than the original upbeat synth track.
Because they tapped into something so fundamentally human, the feeling of being completely overwhelmed by the world. And that easily adapts to the anxieties of any new era.
It's a universal language.
So bringing it all together, we have the story of two kids from the polite, quiet city of Bath who decided that playing dress-up with their music simply wasn't enough to save them.
They used the massive, shiny vehicle of 1980s pop music to test the absolute limits of emotional expression.
They took Arthur Janov's clinical concept of a primal scream for help and engineered it layer by layer into a universal human experience that could fill stadiums and cross generations.
It's an incredible journey.
And if you're listening to this today, I think the greatest takeaway from the Tears for Fears story is proof that you do not have to hide behind a shiny, acceptable facade to connect with people.
In fact, it is often when we are brave enough to share our most authentic, our most difficult, and our most vulnerable selves that our voices resonate the absolute loudest.
It's a powerful reminder of the true function of art. This raises an important question, though, and it's a fascinating one to consider as we wrap up.
What's that?
Well, if Tears for Fears proved that intensely personal, trauma-based lyrics could become massive global dance hits, even in the neon-soaked, escapist optimism of the 1980s, what do the lyrics of the pop music topping the charts today tell us about the collective psychology of our current era? What exactly are we dancing to now?